in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast. Everybody could benefit from metabolic testing, whether you're on the wellness side of things or whether you're on the performance side of things. Welcome to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today, I'm joined by continuing guest host, Coach Aaron Geiser, where we try and answer the question, why you should be doing physiological testing. In this episode, we touch on the benefits and limitations of physiological testing, how you should approach physiological testing, and why you should do repeat testing. We then dive into how physiological testing could be used for health and wellness as well. Overall, I truly believe that physiological testing is something that could benefit people from the health and wellness sphere to sport performance. It really provides good guidance to training intensities and seeing how you are adapting in response to training. This is something that I really hope more people start to do. And if you're interested in getting physiological testing done for your club or for a team, please reach out to me, because I'm able to travel and complete remote physiological testing. Now, without further ado, please enjoy my most recent conversation with Coach Aaron Geiser. Aaron Geiser, welcome back to the show.
It's another exciting day. We get to do some magic on the microphones today.
Magic on the mic. Magic on the mic. Not Magic Mike.
I use those words specifically so we can avoid that.
Yeah. So today, I want to answer the question why you, as a coach or an athlete, should do physiological testing. And this has been kind of a long time coming between a discussion between Aaron and I, because I went down in early January to...
Late January.
Yeah.
What?
Something like that, to Kentucky to do testing with Aaron and his athletes. And it's something that I know Aaron really wanted to do. And I did my master's degree and my PhD with exercise physiology testing with, like lab-based metabolic carts and all this sort of stuff. But now we're starting to see an expansion of devices that are actually available to more of the masses, in a sense, like consumer devices that can be taken from one place to another. You don't have to just go to a lab and get physiological testing done. And it's something that I do think could help you and your athlete really dial in individualized intensity. I think that's one of the biggest benefits of it. So that was one of the things that I've been thinking a lot of, is like, well, what's the benefit of physiological testing? And I wanted to just get Aaron's opinion on that, and then kind of go back and forth on how, some of the limitations of just simply using like an FTP test or maximal heart rate, and then talk a little bit more towards, who would this actually be beneficial for? Is it beneficial for every athlete? Is it beneficial only for certain types of athletes? So Aaron, let's start with, what were the big reasons why you as a coach wanted to get your athletes tested?
Well, I think it starts with we don't know what we don't measure. And by having a correct protocol, or maybe not even using the word correct, by using a specific protocol, we can start to design different types of workouts through different zones to provide the optimal physiological state to absorb the fitness, volume, intensity, effort that we're putting into that session, to make sure that we are getting a response that is going to be positive for the athlete. And if we do not have some of these measures, yes, we can make a quality hypothesis and test them through particular workouts, but this format sometimes takes a long period of time, and there is a little bit of, I mean, there can be some error in the process in analysis because this person, I mean, and that could happen even in these tests that we had individuals come in and do. If they're too fatigued or stress levels are too high or a little bit behind on nutrition or hydration. But if we do this from a hypothesis and have to do it over multiple times, one, it takes a great deal of time, and we have to get a little bit more of a sample size to work out some of the noisy efforts or some of the more inconsistent efforts in that case. So by putting them through a load of tests, what we did through a course of 4-day period, it allowed us to start to kind of work through some of the noise from just 4 tests and start to bring all of that information together. So the long answer of it is it provides a greater snapshot of how to move that physiological needle for your athletes in a positive direction.
Yeah, I think that is a really good initial explanation. Is I think physiological testing gives you a more strict estimate of where these zones are occurring. And I say estimate because you touched on this exactly. If an individual is fatigued, if they're behind on fueling, if they have high stress, if they are dehydrated, all of those things are actually going to affect your zones and going to be reflected within the physiological testing or other things that you are doing. So these tests, I would take that actually as a benefit of these tests, because if you're doing these tests over time, you're going to start to get snapshots of how an athlete is responding when they're stressed, how an athlete is responding if they're dehydrated, other things like that. It also gives you a why behind what their performance is. Physiology, what we're trying to do is we're trying to explain why somebody is adapting the way they are adapting. So by measuring these variables like VO2 max, first and second threshold, fat max in some cases, efficiency values, economy values, we can actually see, oh, this person's performance is improving and their X variable also improved over this course of time. Or their performance is getting worse and these variables are also getting worse. So then you can say, because that's another thing, is if you know how training is changing a physiological variable, then you can also then go back to that training and get a better idea of how that adaptation can occur in the most efficient amount of time, as opposed to just kind of being like, yeah, we did this this crazy training plan that had a mixture of tons and tons of different things. We didn't measure any of their physiology before and after, but we know their performance went up. So we know that out of the 15 or 20 different variables that changed, one of them or a combination of all 20 of them helped to improve their performance. But we have no idea. It's kind of like it's kind of like a little black box, right? You know, you have your training, you have a black box, and then you have performance. Physiology kind of illuminates a little bit more of what's inside that black box. It's not perfect because we're not measuring all of physiology, but it's getting us closer.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that we both, you and I, have recognized in probably the post testing meetings with the athletes is that the athletes have been able to see some of the numbers that I've been making decisions before time and putting it in kind of a understandable box that allows them to also see, oh, okay, well, now I have a bigger picture of why and some of the things that have been going on before of why it's been going on and why we've been prescribing these particular workouts.
Yeah, exactly. If you always have athletes who are asking, oh, well, why this intensity? Why, these sort of intervals, other things like that. With physiological testing, you have a little bit more of fuel in terms of graphs and numbers and metrics that you can actually start to show to your athletes. So it gives you as a coach a little bit more of an explanation and why to your reasoning. And I think that just does help to build your credibility as a coach as well. So I think that's another part of it, is whether you're testing with your athletes or if you're, doing independent or having somebody independently come in like myself, having those conversations where it's so for Aaron and I, Aaron is coaching his individuals. Obviously he knows me, but after the testing, him and I have a conversation. Hey, this is what's going on with this athlete. This is what I think's going on. Aaron understands the physiology that we're, trying to detect and the numbers and metrics that we're trying to do. So then he can take that and he can change the training plan accordingly. And then we also had a meeting where it was myself, Aaron, and the athlete. So the athlete could ask, me, the physiologist, any sort of physiological based questions as well. So it's all levels of communication. And I really do think it is something that, even though the athletes may not walk away with massive game changing things, what we can say to them is we say, okay, well, we tweaked your zone 2 to this based on the results of this test. We tweaked your high intensity stuff based on this. And then we left the rest the same because historical data shows that, your physiological testing and your historical data are matching up pretty well. So we don't need to change it. So it just gives a better roadmap to success in terms of better performance. Cause that's what it all comes down to, is if you have competitive athletes, whether it's, somebody who is just doing their first marathon to somebody who's trying to, podium, on the pro level, everybody wants better performance. And to be a good coach, you have to help give an individual a good roadmap to actually get there and have explanations if they want the explanation. Some athletes are just like, yep, I don't need the explanation. You just program it for me and I'll do it. But we were just on a call with one of Aaron's athletes, and he was like, I just go into my Training Peaks and I do my workout most of the time. But what's really beneficial is that, all of the reports that you sent me, I can go back and I can just take a look and I can see what's going on and what's the why behind it, if I am interested in it. So it's establishing credibility, and it's establishing the individualization of training. And something that I see time and time again that kind of frustrates me, and yes, it's better than nothing, but it's using one metric to determine every training zone. I can guarantee you, so for example, max heart rate is perfect example here. You get max heart rate, and whether that's age predicted, which I don't recommend at all, or from a testing perspective, right? You could just do a step test, measure your heart rate, and then you get your max heart rate from there. You can do, or people recommend then doing 90, 80, 70, 60, 50%, and that's your zones. What we find though, when we actually do metabolic testing and physiological testing, is that zone 2 for one individual might be occurring at 65 to 75% or 65 to 70%, whereas in another individual who hasn't done a lot of that low intensity work might be 40 or 50%. Honestly, it could be super, super low. So those general recommendations, just like the general heart rate equations and other things like that, are good for populations, but they miss the boat on the individual because there's so much inter-individual variability that you're kind of just missing. Again, it's better than nothing, but I think if you're truly trying to be an optimal coach and take advantage of the time that people have to train, you're really missing out if you're not doing something that is going to give you some level of precision intensity zoning or way of telling the athlete, hey, you're going too hard or you're going too easy. We need to dial it in a little bit more.
Well, and also to kind of throw a little bit on top of what you just said about how different individuals have different point of what zone 2 or whatever zone might be.
Mm-hmm.
I've also, in the variety of athletes that I've worked with, I mean, somebody might have a higher like percentage from zone 2. It might be 70% to 83%, and
Right.
then they have smaller availability zones of like what we call kind of Ironman pace at L3A or L3B as 70.3 pace. Maybe those two zones are a little bit smaller because one, they can't sustain that output, whether it be a power recommendation or their heart rate starts to cause them to go too deep into substrate utilization. Sometimes those numbers are also going to be different from one person to the next, and that general maybe 10% jump from each zone to each zone could end up throwing one athlete into a completely catastrophic event if they're racing at 70.3 at the top end of that zone 3 or L3A or L3B as we call it. So maybe they go down to, instead of 90%, they should be somewhere at 87 or 88%.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also another factor of, especially from a laboratory testing, substrate testing side of things, you can start to really pinpoint where that point is that the athlete's burning calories a certain way, and that's gonna, hey, this is a catastrophic place.
Yep.
If you're looking to go for this particular length of time and how many grams of carbohydrates you're able to store compared to how many carbohydrates you're sending out with this particular effort. So
Right.
I think it also provides a great deal of information to allow you to start designing even what those like race pace efforts are and the specificity that you're trying to move with that, because it might not necessarily just be about getting the athlete to be able to tolerate it if they can't get within that window of how many calories they're properly, or how many carbohydrates they're burning per hour with what they're able to store in that case.
Yeah, and I think too, you said something perfectly there, is this physiological testing gives us a starting point for how to adjust the zones. Physiological testing doesn't stop once the mask comes off. It actually kind of starts, I would say, from there, because what happens is from that testing, you should be able to determine all the necessary zones for the adaptations that are necessary, or you should be able to estimate them. I want to choose my words carefully here. You should be able to start to estimate the intensities for the specific zones. But then you as a coach, you as a self-coached athlete, what you're going to do is you're going to take those estimations and you're going to actually do your training. And by doing your training in different environments, different time courses, different volumes, different intensities, you're able to actually manipulate and change based on the inputs and the outputs that are actually occurring to say, okay, this athlete truly should be able to do on an ideal day a half Ironman between 74 and 84% of their VO2 max, or whatever it is, or this heart rate and this heart rate, or this power and this power. And it should constantly kind of be fluctuating, right? You might have somebody who has a very, very high zone 2, which then in a very large range, 70 to 80%, 70 to 85%. And then maybe their Ironman race pace or their half Ironman race pace is actually like only a 5% gap. But through specific training, you might be able to extend, say, the half Ironman to a 10% gap, where you say, okay, well, we know that this individual should be able to go from 200 to 220 now after the specific training that we did, and based on the 2-hour bike ride they did at Ironman or half Ironman specific training. So the physiological testing should never be done in a vacuum. And B, it should be repeated over time as well, because you want to be able to track, again, how your physiology is changing over time. But to fill in those gaps between the tests, you need to do proper testing that is going to allow you to change your zones based off of how an athlete's responding to things. Oh, shoot, we turned up the heat and the humidity, and all of a sudden, all of their zones shifted down by, 60 watts. And their half Ironman maintainable pace actually went from, 150 watts to 200 watts to 145 to 150 watts. And, so that individual now you can say, oh, wow, they're super sensitive to the heat. We need to do some heat training. So in a sense, it can also give you ways of actually guiding and tweaking training as well once you start to figure this sort of stuff out. And we've only covered this in 19 minutes. I will say that it is so much more nuanced and so much more challenging and complicated to actually do this. But this hopefully will give everybody like a little bit of a framework and a reframing of why you should start using physiological testing, and then how you can iterate on that within your training as well.
Absolutely. And this, I still think that there is ways an athlete that might not be fully aware or understanding of the subject can still learn from the information that's provided and have that guide them if they are self-coach. But if you are coached by somebody that has a background in sports physiology, it 100% provides that coach the ability to really have a lot more tools at their resource.
Yeah, and I would say too, you want to make sure before you go and do physiological testing that it makes sense for who you are as an athlete. Like, are you somebody who has never trained before? If you're only going to do one physiological test because it's like a 5-hour drive to go do it and it's going to cost $500, then maybe it's not the best, sort of starting point. But if you have like a local university where you can sign up to be like a participant in a study where they're going to do a VO2 max test for you, and then you can get that data and outsource it to a coach or myself or, somebody along those lines that can actually analyze the data correctly for you, then it might be worth it as a starting point. But you also have to remember too that, and I think we touched on this in the last episode that you and I recorded, it's important to have tests that are going to yield the most performance-related physiological data for you. So, for example, what every athlete that I tested with Aaron did is, as opposed to doing a traditional 1-minute step test where every minute we're increasing intensity until failure, what we did, because all of these individuals are fit individuals who are doing half Ironman or Ironman triathlons as their goal races, I actually extended that protocol because what I wanted to see is I wanted to see their tipping points in their physiology. So we did 3 minutes at a really, really low intensity, and then we just slowly crept it up. 3 minutes on, 1 minute off, 3 minutes on, 1 minute off, repeated until essentially failure. And my justification for that is that these individuals are going to have to race a race that is, anywhere from 8 to 16 hours. And they are, so they should be fit enough to do a longish workout, an hour to an hour and a half in terms of the step test. But then on top of that, for example, VO2 max was not my number one priority in measuring their maximal oxygen consumption. It's a popular number now, and a lot of people use it as a metric of, performance or whatever it is. But I can tell you from the research, VO2 max, A, isn't the number one predictor of performance. We need a combination of things. And then B, the longer the distance, the less important VO2 max gets, because you are going to be working at such a small proportion of your maximal oxygen consumption that you should never be close to VO2 max when you're racing an Ironman or a half Ironman. If you are, you did something really, really wrong, and you're gonna wind up not having a good day. So I wanted to get more fidelity in terms of zoning when first threshold was occurring, second threshold was occurring, what their economy values were, and so I could get a better estimate truly of what their zones would actually be, with higher volume. So that's one thing to take into account, is the type of testing that you're doing. And then because I standardized the test for everybody, when I go back to do testing again, they're going to do the same test in the same environment, with the same devices and all of that sort of stuff. So we should be able to get comparable data over time to see how they're actually changing.
Well, and this is the same way that I approach a substrate test as well. And another thing for us to look at it, especially if you do anything that's for longer periods of time. And when I say longer periods of time, even things that are over an hour, I feel like getting to that point where you have had enough time to get a steady state effort within that ramp or that stage, it's super important in the data collecting aspect of things, because if you're just doing a 1 minute ramp test, your heart rate's never ever going to really hit that steady state effort for that particular effort output. And when you go to design zones, it's going to be very, very difficult, because you never got that kind of like settling point where the heart rate actually starts to regulate within that effort output. And it can really be, if you do have a individual trying to perform this test and they say, okay, well, I want to do a ramp test, and the ramp tests are 1 minute long, I would lean more to somebody that's going to do a stages test that's going to be 3 to 4, even 5 minutes. It can be in length, because you're going to get more data that's going to be able to be utilized down the road. Because again, with that 1 minute ramp test, you're just not getting the number. Like, you're seeing a constant elevation or drift in the heart rate, because there's a constant drift in the output through that minute. So it's just, it really provides you with a lot more detail if you're in that stage for a decent amount of time to get that steady state, collect the data that you need. Then that's when you start to ramp it up a little bit more, and then you are there for the same amount of time, and then you ramp it up a little bit more. You get a heck of a lot more usable data in that case than just seeing, well, okay, well, your heart rate consistently drove like up from the first minute of the test to the last minute of the test until you stopped.
Right. And there is a significant lag in heart rate in terms of its ability to equilibrate. It might not equilibrate actually in the higher intensities, but you could, at the end of that 1 minute, you could still be on the upward trend. So then when you actually do have somebody go to do training based on heart rate, if you do a fast ramp, you might actually be estimating everything slightly low in terms of where their heart rates and powers should actually be. I will say, though, for individuals where VO2 max is, arguably the most important piece of their performance, so, like a miler to maybe 5K, getting a good estimation of what their VO2 max is and what the power or the speed that their VO2 max is actually occurring could be extremely useful. So, but again, it's like what we talk about all the time. It's so context specific, and for most people, or most individuals nowadays, it's half marathon. If you're in the triathlon world, even an Olympic distance is still a fairly long piece of time to be racing. But anything beyond that, half Ironman, full Ironman, ultras, other things like that, I have a tendency to as long as somebody is fit enough to handle an hour to an hour and a half of work, I have a tendency to want to do the longer tests because I think I can glean as a physiologist more information out of that compared to just a 1 minute ramp test. But I will say honestly, if I test people from a wellness perspective or individuals who are a little bit less trained who have never done VO2 max tests before, doing a couple stages of fairly easy but consistent warm up, that are 5 to 10 minutes long each on the front end of a 1 minute ramp test can also get me some pretty good information that can then be used for zoning and other things like that. But everything is a trade-off. There's no perfect test, because then the question is like, well, should you really start every individual at 60 watts on the bike? It's like, no, probably not. Like we had one individual I think got up to about 400 watts on the test, and we were going up 20 watts per 3 minutes. So he was on the bike for a really, really long time. That individual in that case, maybe we could have started him at 100. But I also could counter argue that and say, well, 60 watts to about maybe even 180 watts is probably really nothing for him. So we're just using that as a warm-up as it is. And as long as he was properly fueled beforehand, I am not extremely worried about him bonking in a sense. But again, it's all these nuances as well. I just think that, like, starting with physiological testing gives you a little bit of groundwork to be like, okay, now we can estimate our zones a bit better. Now we can track these things over time. But really, that's another key, is you need to do the same test over time. And you might be able to slightly tweak it and do other things like that based on fitness, but I would highly recommend doing the same test repeated over time, so then you can actually minimize any error that might be associated with changing the test or changing the devices that you're using on the test, or other things like that as well.
Well, and that meant, that's a very key piece, is you want a test to be repeatable. And if you're looking to try to drive a number, you would want to test the same outcomes. So therefore, you're actually measuring what your improvement is in that case. So
right.
From one test, don't think that there's information to be sought after from a substrate test to a limiter test to a lactate test, but thinking that one is going to show up across all three, they do change a little bit and makes it much. You're not going to be able to see differences. If their starting point, that's one thing. Mm-hmm. But if you're looking at doing a VO2 max or substrate test and then following it up with a lactate 6 months later, those two are not going to cross paths in giving you the answer of what you are looking for. You would need to do the same test in that 6 month period mm-hmm. to see what the changes have been. But I also look at it from a different approach to, I feel like testing is valuable to really anybody. Mm-hmm. As long as they're utilizing, as long as one, they're going to look for the right number for what they're trying to accomplish. So an individual that, let's say this, somebody that has the capability to train off of VO2. So they have a VO2 master, let's just say that they're in that situation where they have a VO2 master. Them getting a VO2 max could be very, very important for them to operate at 40% of VO2 max mm-hmm. and get the VO2 and operate in exercise within those particular numbers. That could be very, very beneficial for any human being if they're trying to lose weight, if they're trying to improve metabolic health. There's a lot of things that can be beneficial from that. The individual that is looking to lose weight could go into a substrate test and then start to see where their zones are, where they're more efficiently burn a certain style of nutrition or
where they
predominantly
lack burning
calorie.
that nutrition, right? Because with a lot of people who have poor metabolic health, so just so everybody knows, you have to measure oxygen and CO2 to know your substrates. But for a lot of people who have poor metabolic health, they will almost always present as not being able to burn fats. They almost consistently burn carbohydrates. So that would be an indicator, right? That would be a really not an easy way, but a way of saying, hey, we need to do something that allows you to start being a little bit more metabolically flexible, being able to switch to fat oxidation and then go back to carbohydrate oxidation. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I think just like from a detection standpoint, I think that you could use that really, really well there.
Absolutely. And so I guess where I was going with that thought was that we are the first 30 minutes, 34 minutes of this conversation is taking it from the approach of a performance-based athlete. I guess I look at it as any athlete, and I'm just saying anybody that does activity, I'm going to call them an athlete,
Yep.
even if they don't represent themselves as an athlete. But I feel like if you go in looking for the right number to move the needle that you want to accomplish, if it's losing weight, if it's gaining weight, if it's becoming if you want to improve your VO2 max, whatever it might be, I feel like these tests provide you with the opportunity to measure, work, and measure again, and work and measure again, and see some actual progression through that process that then tells you, oh, okay, I'm doing things the right way to accomplish the goal that I have. And if you measure, work, and measure again and find that that did not move you in the right direction, you can call an audible on your training style that next block, and let's emphasize something differently and see if that does move the needle. So I really, as I said, I know we are approaching this from the early part of this conversation from a performance standpoint, just an overall, but I feel like if you're going in with the right substance, or for the right target, you as anybody can get benefit from some form of testing as long as the test is done well. The practitioner has a proper protocol to send you down the right path to test and find the numbers and find the guides for what your goals are. But it's also important to know what your goals are. If you are looking to lose weight, be honest with that. I'm going into a laboratory test to try to lose weight. Okay, then that allows that practitioner to implement a protocol that should provide the testing results for numbers that can be managed, approached from a training perspective, and then retested to see if there was improvement.
Yep.
So I feel like that was an important piece to say that anybody can benefit from this. I do recognize that the testing can be expensive, but sometimes if you're gonna put money down, sometimes putting money down on your health, it's the best place that you can put it.
Oh, I 100% agree, and I would say physiological testing is so much more affordable than a quadruple bypass surgery, or developing type 2 diabetes, or coronary artery disease. All things that can be mitigated through proper exercise and nutrition. And that is the awesome thing, like we were saying earlier, about all of these devices that are now coming onto the market and being a little bit more consumer available, is that they hopefully will lower the cost per test, make them more available to individuals. And I think this is something that I've really been praising Peter Attia lately, because I'm reading his book Outlive, and in that he is kind of pushing for metabolic assessments. and allowing it to occur for all individuals, right? Because whether you're on the wellness side or the performance side, like that's kind of where Aaron and I live, currently is in the performance side. But from the wellness perspective of things, dialing in where your, zone 2 or maximal fat oxidation intensity is super important for mitochondrial development, metabolic health, other things like that. On the flip side of things, figuring out what your VO2 max is and seeing if it's improving. VO2 max is the number one predictor of all-cause mortality, and the higher your VO2 max is, the lower your risk of developing chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes, other things like that. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach. And this is the cool thing about how training principles can actually apply to, wellness as well is, probably everybody on this podcast has heard of polarized training. Well, polarized training is probably one of the best things you can do as long as you have as long as you can handle the high intensity stuff. Is probably one of the best things you can do for your health and longevity. From a perspective is do a lot of volume, low intensity work, develop your ability to switch between fats and carbohydrates, and then do your VO2 max work in order to really hammer the system and get your cardiovascular system kind of on par and working a little bit better. Because in this sedentary world where we overeat and there's we really need to start to focus on nutrition and exercise specifically, and this physiological testing kind of can help you gamify, I would say, the actual exercise. Because for the most part, right, if you could say, okay, well, I could do a submaximal exercise test, figure out what my VO2 max prediction is from there, and then you could probably, try to exercise and do that sort of stuff to improve it. But it is another thing to feel like, you're a, I don't know, like superhuman with the mask on, and you're doing the test and you're doing all this other stuff. And you're like, yeah, it's time for my VO2 max test, which I do every quarter or every half of a year. Let's see how things improved. I don't know. That just kind of gets me jazzed. And even if you aren't, pursuing like training or a race or whatever it is kind of cool to feel like Bane from Batman and see how your VO2 max is changing over time. So yeah, I absolutely think that it is something that hopefully more and more people get accustomed with, and more people can actually do, because it's up until now, I think there has been a paucity of availability for the technology that is required to do a VO2 max test, and now it's getting more and more available, I think, probably as we speak.
Well, and I would also for any universities in the States that hear this, I'd start bringing that back to the open public. I think that when we saw COVID, we did recognize a lot of schools kind of condense that opportunity. One, I think it's great for the students because it gives the student an opportunity to do real life testing in a diverse demographic and also age group, where you're not just testing another person that's 21, 22, 23 years old. But if you have that capability, try to bring these things back onto campuses, because one, you're in a lot of places, and two, it's a valuable resource to educate and develop your student base, but give options for individuals within that area to get quality information that they can actually then make health choices off of, and hopefully you can be part of maybe improving the health of your city.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. We can put a public health twist or wrinkle on metabolic testing. Actually, a lot of the times, there are professionally trained exercise physiologists who do cardiopulmonary testing and stress tests for older individuals. I don't think a lot of the times that they use, metabolic carts or indirect calorimetry or anything like that. But if you have a cart and you can make affordable testing opportunities to individuals, and then you can partner with doctors' offices, chiropractic offices, other, maybe physical therapy clinics, other things like that. It gives individuals more opportunity to see. It's like I bet people would be extremely surprised if they started doing VO2 max testing on, entire population. So generally speaking, a good VO2 max would be probably anything above 45, I would say, just in terms of health and wellness. Anything below 25 is you're approaching some really, really big life challenges where just walking upstairs, you might be reaching your VO2 max. So anything above 25 or below 25, individuals are running risks of not being able to independently do the activities of daily life that they're going to want to do in order to avoid having to go into a home or do other things like that. So if we can make this a little bit more mainstream to be like, yep, we have a metabolic device at every doctor's office, and then, periodically you're tested like throughout the year. So once every year, something like that. That will give us indicators of, and I don't think this is going to change, but that will give us indicators of how is somebody trending over time. Because there is certainly a point where if an individual goes below it, there's almost like there's no coming back from it. But the good thing is you can train VO2 max, you can train metabolic flexibility until the day you die. I tell everybody this is like your body has the ability to grow and adapt until the day you die. It's just to what extent can it grow and adapt, and how quickly can it grow and adapt. And right. If you've, especially this is now like more of the wellness side of things. If you've allowed, your muscle mass, your VO2 max, your cardiovascular health, all that sort of stuff to deteriorate over the course of 40, 50, 60 years, that's a very, very large ship to try to right in terms of fixing all of that sort of stuff. So if we start to catch it earlier, then we will be able to keep people healthier longer, effectively increasing their health span rather than their lifespan. Because sometimes, like, you meet people who are like, yeah, I'm going to live to be 100, but then the last 15 years of their life, they're, in hospice care or something like that. Or, like they're not able to do what they want to do. But then on the flip side of things, my grandma, she lived till she was 95, and she was independent and a spitfire until about 94, when she started to have, some pretty bad health issues. But she was one of those people that was just like, yeah, I couldn't get outside today, so I just walked laps around my house, and like up the stairs, down the stairs, around it, all that sort of stuff. So this is really where I think that exercise needs to be more on the forefront of things, and more of a primary treatment, or a primary preventative treatment for this sort of stuff. But it's just a matter of like making people aware of it early, and hopefully with more physiological testing, people and like really good influence from people like Peter Attia and Huberman Lab and other things like that, we start to actually make this a little bit more mainstream. Because like you said, Aaron, everybody could benefit from metabolic testing, whether you're on the wellness side of things or whether you're on the performance side of things.
Well, now that we've gone down that rabbit hole.
I know.
But yeah, I echo that thought, and I think, again, coming back and bringing it back to the performance aspect of things, it just gives us more validity to like the process forward to move needles that the athletes are looking to move.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it gives you the ability to dial the levers or pull the levers that are going to make the biggest difference in an athlete. So I guess with the last 10 minutes here, I want to walk people through, because even like remote physiology testing, like through Moxie Monitor and Trainalyzed, is becoming a little bit more popular, a little bit more mainstream. And Inside does this as well. There's a few other AI companies that do this. But one of the questions I consistently get from coaches is just like, hey, I love this physiology testing, but what the heck do I do with it now? What's the point of measuring this physiology? And where I personally always start is I say, okay, well, let's see where your physiological boundaries or thresholds are actually occurring. Those thresholds or those boundaries are your first threshold or fat max, your second threshold, which can also be talked to as maximal lactate steady state, FTP, critical power, ventilatory threshold 2, lactate threshold 2, whatever it is. It's the delineation between sustainable and unsustainable exercise intensity, and then VO2 max. So you have these three variables that are kind of delineating different points of your physiology. And first and foremost, what I do is I always check where someone's VO2 max is, because I want to see, is their VO2 max requisitely high for the activity that they are trying to do and perform. So, for example, if you have an individual who comes in and they're a long course triathlete and their VO2 max is like 55, I would say, like, okay, you're probably not an elite level athlete, because generally we qualify, elite VO2 maxes as 65 and above or 60 and above. But 55 is really going to set you up to have a very large aerobic engine and help you probably succeed. So as long as your VO2 max is pretty high, I'm generally, I want to keep that number pretty high, but I'm probably not going to specifically attack that as my primary form of adaptation or primary physiological adaptation that I'm aiming for. Then what I do is I look at first threshold and second threshold and see where those are occurring and at what percentage of VO2 max those are actually occurring. For example, if you are doing races that are between 60 and 90 minutes, that second threshold is super important for your performance, because you're probably going to be racing at or slightly above that threshold. But if that second threshold, A, is too low, so say it's happening at like 65% of your VO2 max, or if it's happening at a super, super high percent of your VO2 max, we have two different routes that we can actually go here. We can say, okay, well, we want to do a lot of work for that low threshold, or for the threshold that is too low. We need to do a lot of threshold work to try to pull that threshold higher, because you want it to be a high percentage of your VO2 max. But then on top of that, if your VO2 max, if your second threshold is hitting your VO2 max, then your VO2 max actually might be limiting your ability to actually operate at second threshold and make it go higher. So first what we would do is we would push VO2 max higher, and then we'd be like, okay, now we can pull threshold up. For first threshold or fat max, this is more for the people who are doing like ultra marathons, Ironmans, half Ironmans, fairly long races. Races that are going to be very close to intensity of where second threshold is occurring, maybe a little bit higher. And it's the same sort of process. Is your second threshold, or is your first threshold butted up against your second threshold? Or is your second threshold super, super low? If it's super, super low, then you're going to want to do a lot of specific work at second threshold. And this sounds super boring, and Aaron's laughing right now, but it's exactly, it's kind of how you should think about it. If it's too low, then you're going to want to pull it up by doing specific work a little bit higher than second or first threshold. If it's butting up right against second threshold, then you're going to have to push second threshold up in order to get first threshold to come up. So, and then if all of a sudden your second threshold butts up against your VO2 max, then you have to push your VO2 max up first. So you would have to go VO2 max, then second threshold, then you could push your first threshold up. And that's the way that I think people could actually start to use this, from the perspective of figuring out if there is a physiological limiter. And it's a little bit different than other limiters that we talk about. But from those three, you could actually start to get pointed ideas of where to push things. And that's not to say, though, that you should only focus on that and do block training just to push VO2 max up or whatever it is. You still need to accumulate a lot of volume and some intensity. Where that intensity is depends on what you're trying to push up, what you're going to be racing at, specifically where you're at in the season. But it kind of gives you a little bit more of a framework to be able to, pick what is going to move the needle the most in terms of helping your athlete improve and not have their physiology actually be limiting their performance.
And I mean, that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
That's exactly from a coaching perspective. You want to initially ask the questions that need to be asked, and that is, what is the best way to implement this knowledge into warm-ups, into steady state efforts, into their VO2 max, and then that's how you end up taking this information, implementing it into a training plan, and then allowing the athlete to take advantage of the knowledge that was gained from these particular tests.
Yep. I think that's all I got to say about that. In the words of Forrest Gump.
Really, really bad.
Dang it, we were crushing it, and then I just ended it on a bad note. No, in all seriousness, though, if you're interested in potentially learning more about physiological testing or want to do some of this physiological testing and you have a team like Aaron does, please reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to try to work out a schedule to test some athletes, see if it would be useful. If you're in the Bend area, hit me up. We can do some testing. If you're somewhere else and you want to try to start to do physiological testing and you have questions about it, who should I approach? How should I approach them? I'm always here to answer those sort of questions. If you have any questions for me, obviously you can reach out to me at Critical02 on Instagram. That's where I'm normally at. You can comment down below if you're on YouTube. You can leave us comments on Spotify. I can't respond to them, but I can read them, and then we can address them on subsequent podcasts. You can find Aaron at Try a Geiser. Are you still doing or on Instagram, are you still doing the long ride on Zwift every Saturday morning?
That's
of
like
course.
The sun showing up in the morning.
I know, man. It's like you're like, I get on the bike and it's actually sunny and it's nice.
Well, it's warm, we'll say.
Hey, we're just getting the heat adaptations now. But yeah, the reason why we do this podcast is to help you guys make more informed decisions and help train your athletes and train yourselves better. So we hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.